In 1942, millions of people across Europe woke up each morning to a world that felt suspended in time. The war had been underway for years, yet for most civilians, daily life continued not through moments of action, but through repetition. Days were shaped by routine, by small decisions, and by the quiet work of simply getting through another morning. This was the middle of World War II, but it was not experienced as a constant series of dramatic events. Instead, 1942 unfolded slowly, measured in weeks of rationing, in letters sent and unanswered, in familiar streets walked again and again. This video explores that slower rhythm, not battles or strategies, but the texture of ordinary life. How people woke, ate, worked, waited, and went to sleep during a year that felt long, even as it passed, one day at a time. Morning in 1942 often began in silence. In many European cities and towns, alarms were not the sound of clocks, but of habit. People rose early, not out of urgency, but because fuel was limited and daylight mattered. Homes were colder than they had been just a few years earlier. Coal, wood, and heating oil were scarce, and most households learned quickly that warmth was something to be rationed as carefully as food. Bedrooms were dim, often lit only by the pale light, filtering through curtains that had been kept heavy and dark since the introduction of blackout regulations. Windows were covered carefully each night and uncovered again each morning. A ritual repeated so often it became automatic. Clothing was worn in layers. Garments were mended repeatedly, sometimes patched with mismatched fabric, sometimes reinforced at the elbows or knees where wear showed fastest. New clothes were rare. Most people dressed in what they already owned, adjusted and readjusted to last as long as possible. Breakfast, when it was eaten, was modest. In much of Europe, rationing systems were fully established by 1942. Families planned their meals not around preference, but around availability. Bread, often darker and heavier than before the war, was a staple. Butter was scarce. Sugar was carefully measured. Coffee, where it existed at all, was frequently a substitute made from roasted grains or chicory. Meals were quieter affairs. There was less waste, less abundance, and less variety. Food was eaten slowly, not as an indulgence, but as a necessity to be managed. Many households kept small notebooks or mental tallies, tracking what could be used today and what needed to last until the next ration period. Children learned these rhythms early. They understood that some foods were occasional, that seconds were rare, and that asking for more often meant waiting. After breakfast, the day began in earnest. Work schedules in 1942 were shaped by both necessity and absence. Across Europe, many working-age men were no longer present, having been conscripted or displaced by the war. Their roles were filled by women, older workers, teenagers, and anyone else able to contribute. Factories ran long shifts. Farms relied on every available hand. Offices, transport services, and municipal buildings continued to function, even as staffing changed and resources thinned. Commuting looked different than it once had. Fuel shortages reduced private travel. Trams, bicycles, and walking became more common. Streets were quieter in some places, busier in others, depending on industry and proximity to production centers. People walked familiar routes daily, passing the same buildings, the same posters, the same shop windows displaying fewer goods than before. Time felt stretched. Distances seemed longer. A walk to work was not rushed but steady, paced by routine rather than urgency. School children followed altered schedules. Some schools operated irregular hours, sharing buildings, or closing temporarily due to shortages or safety concerns. Lessons continued, though often simplified. Education was still valued, but it was no longer insulated from the realities outside the classroom. Mornings were often the most structured part of the day. They provided a sense of control in a world where larger events felt distant and uncontrollable. People focused on what could be done, getting dressed, preparing food, arriving where they were needed. These small accomplishments mattered. In 1942, news rarely arrived quickly. Radios existed, but broadcasts were scheduled, limited, and carefully controlled. Newspapers were thin, printed on lower quality paper, and filled with official language that offered little detail. Rumors traveled faster than facts, carried quietly between neighbors or overheard in queues. Most people began their days without knowing what might change by nightfall. Air raids, restrictions, or announcements could interrupt routines without warning. But until they did, the morning belonged to habit. There was comfort in this repetition. The familiar sounds of doors opening, footsteps on stairs, bicycles rolling over stone streets. These were anchors. They reminded people that despite uncertainty, life continued in recognizable ways. As the morning progressed, households emptied. Kitchens grew quiet. Streets filled briefly, then thinned again as people settled into their assigned roles for the day. And by mid-morning in 1942, across Europe, millions were already thinking ahead, not to the end of the war, but simply to lunch, to the next letter, to the slow passage of another ordinary day. By late morning in 1942, attention often turned toward food, not with excitement, but with calculation. Meals were no longer spontaneous. They were planned carefully, sometimes days or weeks in advance, shaped by ration cards, local availability, and quiet exchanges of information between neighbors. Food had become a system, and understanding that system was part of everyday life. Across much of Europe, rationing was already a familiar reality by this point in the war. It was not new in 1942, but it had settled into permanence. People no longer expected it to end soon. Instead, they adapted. Ration cards were carried carefully, often kept in wallets or small envelopes, protected from loss or damage. Each card represented not abundance, but permission. Permission to buy a specific amount of a specific item during a specific period of time. Bread was usually the most reliable staple. Though its quality varied, flour was stretched with other grains. Loaves were denser, darker, and smaller than before the war. Butter, meat, eggs, and sugar were limited, sometimes severely. Fresh fruit could be rare, depending on the season and region. Shopping was rarely a single errand. People moved from shop to shop, queue to queue, sometimes waiting for hours without certainty that goods would still be available when they reached the front. Lines formed early in the day, and word traveled quickly if something unexpected arrived, a delivery of vegetables, a small supply of meat, or a substitute product not usually seen. Waiting became a shared experience. Conversations in queues were often quiet and practical. People exchanged information more than opinions. Which shop had bread that morning? Which substitute tasted better? Which day the next delivery was expected? There was an unspoken understanding that everyone was managing scarcity together, even when circumstances differed. Frustration existed, but it was often subdued, absorbed into the routine. Midday meals reflected this reality. Lunch was simple, sometimes nothing more than bread with a thin spread, soup made from vegetables and scraps, or leftovers carefully stretched from the day before. In workplaces and factories, meals were eaten quickly and without ceremony. Canteens existed in some industries, offering standardized portions designed to keep workers going rather than satisfy appetite. These meals were functional, predictable, and rarely discussed beyond their adequacy. At home, those not working outside often used the middle of the day to plan ahead. Vegetables were cleaned and prepared carefully. Peelings were saved. Bones and scraps were set aside for broths. Nothing was discarded without thought. Cooking itself became quieter, slower, and more deliberate. Recipes changed. Cookbooks published during the war emphasized substitution and economy. Ingredients were listed in flexible terms, acknowledging that availability varied from household to household. Measurements were suggestions rather than rules. Meals were shaped by what could be found, not by what was desired. In many households, gardens became increasingly important. Even small plots were used to grow vegetables, herbs, and anything that could supplement rations. These gardens were tended carefully, often before or after work, becoming another daily responsibility. The act of growing food provided more than nourishment. It offered a sense of agency, something that could be tended, measured, and relied upon in a time when so much felt uncertain. By early afternoon, routines resumed. Work continued. Children returned to school or helped at home. Errands filled the spaces between responsibilities. Repair replaced replacement. Clothing was mended. Shoes were resoled. Objects were kept in use far beyond their intended lifespan. Time moved differently in these hours. Without the distractions of abundance or variety, days were structured around necessity. Tasks followed one another steadily, not rushed, not delayed. The middle of the day was neither hopeful nor despairing. It simply existed. News, when it arrived, often did so indirectly. A radio broadcast overheard in a workplace, a headline glimpsed in a shop window, a comment passed quietly from one person to another. Information filtered slowly, often incomplete and rarely comforting. People learned not to seek constant updates. Instead, they focused on what was immediately in front of them: the task at hand, the next meal, the coming evening. In this way, midday in 1942 became a bridge. It connected the structured beginnings of the morning to the quieter, more inward hours that followed. It carried people forward without asking them to look too far ahead. And as afternoon settled across Europe, the rhythm of the day softened, preparing once again for evenings shaped by routine, restriction, and familiar silence. By afternoon, in 1942, the urgency of the morning had faded, replaced by a quieter, more measured stretch of the day. For many, this was the longest part of the day, not because it was difficult, but because it unfolded slowly. Without the variety and distractions that had once filled everyday life, afternoons became spaces to be occupied carefully. Errands were deliberate. A visit to a shop was planned around availability rather than convenience. People walked familiar routes, often carrying baskets or cloth bags that had been used for years. These walks were rarely hurried. There was little reason to rush, and little expectation that speed would change the outcome. Transportation was limited. Fuel shortages made private vehicles rare, and public transport operated on reduced schedules. Bicycles became essential. Walking became routine. Streets bore the marks of prolonged strain. Shop windows were sparse, sometimes displaying empty shelves or single items placed carefully to suggest order, where abundance was absent. Posters were common, official notices, instructions, reminders, layered over one another as regulations changed. People passed these signs daily. absorbing them without conscious thought. Afternoons were often spent maintaining what already existed. Clothing was repaired. Buttons were sewn back on. Socks were darned repeatedly until fabric itself became thin. These tasks were done quietly, often without conversation, filling time while conserving resources. Shoes received particular attention. Leather was scarce, and new footwear was difficult to obtain. Soles were repaired, stitched, and reinforced. Children learned to walk carefully, aware that shoes could not easily be replaced. Households adapted their expectations. Objects were no longer temporary. They were companions, expected to last indefinitely. A cracked cup was still useful. A worn coat was still worn. Nothing was discarded without careful consideration. For those not working in factories or offices, afternoons could feel empty. Entertainment options were limited. Cinemas existed in some places, but attendance varied depending on restrictions and safety. Radios filled some hours, though broadcasts were scheduled and repetitive. Reading became more common, though books and newspapers were shared, borrowed, and reread. Libraries operated when possible. Old books were rediscovered, their familiar pages offering comfort through repetition. Children played differently. Games were simpler, often improvised, shaped by available space and materials. Streets, courtyards, and small patches of open ground became playgrounds. Toys were repaired, repurposed, or shared among siblings. There was an understanding, unspoken but present, that play needed to remain close to home. As afternoon wore on, attention often shifted inward. People thought about letters not yet answered, about family members absent, about tasks that needed to be done tomorrow or next week. The future was not imagined in large terms. It was broken into manageable pieces. Dinner was considered early. Ingredients were assessed. Portions were calculated. Meals were planned, not for satisfaction, but for sustainability. The goal was to ensure that something would be available not just tonight, but in the days ahead. In 1942, this kind of thinking had become second nature. Time was no longer divided by leisure and activity, but by necessity. Hours passed quietly, marked not by clocks, but by routine tasks, completed one after another. Afternoons were rarely dramatic. They were defined by steadiness, by the quiet persistence of ordinary actions repeated day after day. In the absence of certainty, consistency itself became reassuring. As light began to soften and shadows lengthened across streets and rooms, the day began to turn once more toward evening, toward the familiar rituals that closed out another ordinary day in a year that seemed to stretch endlessly forward. Evenings in 1942 arrived earlier than they once had. As daylight faded, households across Europe began a series of routines that were as familiar as they were necessary. The transition from afternoon to night was deliberate, shaped by regulation, habit, and caution. Blackout procedures were among the most carefully observed rituals of the day. Curtains were drawn tightly. Windows were covered with heavy fabric or paper. Any light that might escape into the street was adjusted, dimmed, or extinguished entirely. Lamps were positioned carefully. Candles were used sparingly. This process was repeated every night, regardless of weather or mood. Over time, it required little thought. Hands moved automatically, checking corners and seams, ensuring that nothing glowed where it should not. Once the blackout was complete, homes settled into a quieter state. Evening meals were simple, often built from what had been prepared earlier in the day. Soup was common. Stews stretched small portions of meat or vegetables across several meals. Bread was divided carefully. Dinner was rarely rushed, but it was also rarely indulgent. Conversation, when it happened, stayed close to home. Practical matters, shared observations, small plans for the next day. Radios became important companions in the evening hours. Broadcasts were listened to attentively, though often without expectation. News bulletins were brief and controlled. Music and familiar voices offered structure, marking time in a world where days could otherwise blur together. People gathered around radios not just for information, but for connection. Hearing voices from outside the home provided reassurance that the wider world still existed, even if access to it felt distant. When broadcasts ended, silence returned quickly. Outside, cities and towns changed character at night. Streets were darker than they had ever been. Shop signs were unlit, streetlights were dimmed or turned off entirely. Familiar routes became harder to recognize, navigated by memory rather than sight. Footsteps echoed more clearly. Sounds carried farther. The absence of light altered perception, making even ordinary streets feel unfamiliar. People moved carefully. Those who ventured out did so with purpose, rarely lingering. Social visits were shorter. Curfews and safety concerns limited movement. Nighttime became a private space, reserved for rest rather than activity. Indoors, evenings were quiet. Without bright light or entertainment, time slowed further. Reading by low light strained the eyes. Handwork continued when possible, knitting, sewing, small repairs, but often stopped early to conserve energy and resources. Children were sent to bed sooner. Adults followed not long after. Sleep schedules shifted earlier, shaped by darkness and fatigue. The night was long, and mornings came early. Rest was necessary, yet sleep was not always easy. Uncertainty lingered in the quiet. The mind wandered when distractions were few. Distant sounds, a train passing, an aircraft overhead, an unfamiliar noise, drew attention quickly. Still, most nights passed without incident. People learned to rest despite uncertainty. They trusted routine more than reassurance. Closing the day became an act of endurance rather than reflection. Before sleep, households prepared for morning once again. Clothes were set out, fuel was arranged, ration cards were placed where they would not be forgotten. These small preparations offered comfort, proof that tomorrow, whatever it brought, could be approached in familiar ways. In 1942, the end of the day rarely brought closure. There were no conclusions, no clear milestones reached by nightfall. Instead, each evening marked another completed cycle. Another day lived quietly, deliberately, and without resolution. As homes grew dark and streets emptied, Europe settled into sleep, holding its breath not for dramatic change, but for the simple continuation of ordinary life. The passage of time in 1942 was felt less through calendars and more through seasons. Without the markers of celebration or travel that had once divided the year, people paid closer attention to daylight, temperature, and weather. These natural changes shaped daily life in ways that felt immediate and unavoidable. Winter carried particular weight. Cold settled into homes that were difficult to heat. Fuel shortages meant fires were small and carefully timed. Rooms were closed off to conserve warmth. Families gathered in single spaces, sharing heat as much as company. Clothing became heavier. Coats were layered over sweaters. Scarves and gloves were worn indoors as often as outdoors. Fabric grew thinner with use, yet continued to serve. Winter meals were shaped by preservation. Root vegetables, stored carefully from earlier harvests, formed the backbone of many diets. Soups and stews returned again and again, providing warmth and efficiency. Bread was eaten slowly. Nothing was wasted. Darkness came early. Evenings lengthened, and mornings were dim. The day felt compressed, as though light itself had been rationed. People moved deliberately, conserving energy and attention. Winter also brought quiet. Streets were emptier. Travel was more difficult. Social life contracted further. The world narrowed to essentials: warmth, food, rest, and routine. When spring arrived, it was noticed immediately. Longer days brought relief. Light returned to kitchens and workspaces. Windows were opened cautiously. Fresh air felt restorative. Gardens were prepared once again. Soil was turned. Seeds were planted carefully, often saved from previous years. The act of planting carried hope, not for sudden change, but for continuity. Spring altered the rhythm of the day. Mornings began earlier. Afternoons stretched longer. Work expanded outdoors. The year loosened its grip slightly. Summer in 1942 brought its own challenges. Heat made fuel conservation less urgent, but introduced new concerns. Food spoiled more easily. Water was managed carefully. Clothing grew lighter, though replacements were scarce. Long daylight hours extended productivity. People worked later into the evening, making use of natural light before blackout routines began. The contrast between bright days and darkened nights became more pronounced. Summer evenings were brief transitions. As the sun set, blackout measures returned quickly. The warmth lingered even as lights disappeared. Windows were opened carefully, covered but ventilated when possible. Autumn arrived quietly. Harvests were gathered where possible. Preservation resumed. Households prepared for another winter, knowing now what to expect. Each season in 1942 felt familiar, yet altered. The natural cycle continued, but under constraint. Weather mattered more. Light mattered more. Clothing, fuel, and food were adjusted carefully to match the changing year. Emotionally, the seasons offered structure. They marked progress without promising resolution. They reminded people that time was moving, even when circumstances remained unchanged. By the end of the year, many felt that 1942 had been unusually long, not because more happened, but because each day required attention. Each season demanded adaptation. The passage of time was felt in effort rather than event. People did not speak often about the year as a whole. They spoke about winters and summers, about shortages and improvements, about what worked and what didn't. In this way, the year was lived in pieces. And as the seasons turned once again toward winter, daily life in Europe continued, steady, constrained, and quietly persistent, carrying people forward one ordinary day at a time. In 1942, much of life was spent waiting. Waiting for news, waiting for letters, waiting for supplies to arrive, or restrictions to ease, or clarity to return. Waiting became a condition rather than an activity, something woven quietly into every day. Communication moved slowly. Letters were written carefully, often by hand, using limited paper. Words were chosen with restraint. People wrote not to alarm, but to reassure. Details were softened. Difficult truths were omitted or implied, rather than stated. Mail traveled unevenly. Some letters arrived weeks after they were sent. Others never arrived at all. Envelopes were opened cautiously, aware that silence could mean many things. The arrival of a letter was an event. It interrupted routine. It shifted attention. People reread familiar lines repeatedly, memorizing handwriting, preserving paper as long as possible. Letters were folded carefully, stored safely, taken out and read again in quieter moments. Responses were planned slowly. There was no urgency to reply quickly when delivery itself was uncertain. Instead, people waited until they had something steady to say, something that would endure the long journey. Radios filled some of the gaps. Broadcasts offered scheduled moments of connection. Voices from beyond the home reminded listeners that they were part of something larger, even when direct contact felt distant. Yet radio news was limited. Information was framed carefully, often without detail. Listeners learned to listen between the lines, to notice what was said and what was left unsaid. Silence carried its own meaning. Days without letters passed quietly. People adjusted expectations. Absence became normal. Emotions were managed deliberately. Hope was kept modest. Fear was kept contained. There was little room for extremes. Too much anticipation led to disappointment. Too much despair made daily life impossible. Instead, people settled into an emotional middle ground. They focused on routine, on tasks that could be completed, on days that could be endured. Waiting was rarely discussed openly. It was shared without conversation. Neighbors understood. Families adjusted together. In workplaces, talk stayed practical. In homes, conversation returned repeatedly to small, familiar topics. The future, when mentioned, was vague. Plans extended days or weeks ahead, rarely further. This approach offered stability. By narrowing their focus, people preserved energy. They avoided imagining outcomes they could not influence. Time passed slowly, but not aimlessly. Each day contained structure. Each week followed a pattern. Even in uncertainty, there was order. By late evening, thoughts often returned to those absent. Letters were reread, names were spoken quietly. Memory filled the spaces left by absence. Sleep came unevenly, but it came. People rested not because they felt at peace, but because rest was necessary. Morning would come, and routine would resume. In this way, waiting in 1942 became both burden and protection. It asked for patience, but offered continuity. It required restraint, but preserved balance. And through waiting, daily life continued, steady, quiet, and unresolved, moving forward without resolution, one letter, one day, one season at a time. By 1942, absence had become part of the landscape. Empty places at tables, missing voices in familiar routines, gaps in workplaces and neighborhoods that no longer required explanation. Life continued not by ignoring these absences, but by adjusting around them. Workplaces reflected these changes clearly. Roles shifted quietly. Tasks once handled by those no longer present were redistributed. Women took on responsibilities that had previously been closed to them. Older workers returned to roles they had left behind. Teenagers stepped into adult routines earlier than expected. These changes were not framed as milestones. They were practical responses to necessity. Work needed to be done. Systems needed to function. People adapted without ceremony. Factories ran continuously where possible. Shifts were long, breaks were short. Work was repetitive, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. The rhythm of labor filled the day, offering structure even as it demanded endurance. In offices and municipal buildings, paperwork continued. Forms were filled out. Records were kept. schedules were maintained. Much of the war effort, from the civilian perspective, existed on paper: lists, permits, instructions, notices. This administrative work rarely drew attention, but it was constant. At home, responsibilities expanded. Household management grew more complex. Budgeting required care. Rations needed tracking. Repairs needed planning. Tasks were shared differently, often redistributed without discussion. Children contributed where they could. They ran errands, helped with chores, learned skills earlier than previous generations. Childhood shortened not through trauma, but through responsibility. Communities adjusted quietly. Neighbors relied on one another in small ways. Information was shared. Items were borrowed and returned. Help was offered without fanfare. There was a balance between cooperation and privacy. People respected boundaries. Hardship was understood without being displayed. Assistance was given subtly, preserving dignity on both sides. Social life continued in reduced form. Visits were shorter. Gatherings were smaller. Celebrations were muted or postponed. Even so, connection remained important. Conversations focused on shared experiences rather than opinions, on daily matters rather than distant outcomes. The present was enough to fill the space. Religious services, where they continued, offered routine rather than revelation. Attendance varied. Messages emphasized endurance, patience, and continuity. Rituals provided familiarity, even when belief felt strained. Public spaces reflected restraint. Cafes operated when possible, though menus were limited. Parks remained places for walking rather than gathering. Streets were used efficiently, not leisurely. Despite this, communities retained identity. Local habits persisted. Accents remained. Traditions adapted rather than disappeared. Life bent under pressure, but it did not break uniformly. Emotionally, people learned to regulate themselves. Expressions of joy were quiet. Expressions of grief were contained. Extremes were avoided in favor of steadiness. This emotional moderation was not imposed. It emerged naturally from prolonged uncertainty. By maintaining balance, people protected themselves and those around them. As days passed, work continued, absences remained, and adjustments became routine. What once felt temporary now felt established. And in this steady state, daily life in 1942 moved forward, supported by cooperation, shaped by necessity, and sustained by the quiet effort of people adapting together. As 1942 progressed, many people stopped thinking about the future in clear terms, not because they lacked hope, but because imagining outcomes had become exhausting. The future was too large, too uncertain, and too distant to hold comfortably. Instead, life narrowed its focus. People thought in days, sometimes in weeks, rarely beyond that. Planning extended only as far as it needed to in order to keep life functioning. Tomorrow's work, next week's ration period, the coming season. This way of thinking offered stability. By limiting expectations, people protected themselves from disappointment. They learned to measure time not by anticipation, but by completion. Another day managed, another task finished, another routine repeated. In this way, time in 1942 felt different. It did not rush forward, nor did it stand still. It stretched. Days felt long, yet indistinct. Weeks blended together, marked only by small variations. Weather changes, shortages, brief news items. Calendars were less important than before. Dates mattered less than cycles. Morning followed night. Work followed rest. Meals followed effort. These patterns replaced milestones. People adjusted their internal sense of progress. Rather than looking for change, they looked for continuity. Stability itself became an achievement. Conversations reflected this shift. When the future was mentioned, it was framed cautiously. After this, when things are different, rarely with specifics, these phrases acknowledged change without demanding details. Hope was present, but subdued. It existed as a background condition, not a driving force. Something quiet and persistent, rather than urgent or expansive. Memory played a role as well. People remembered how life had been before, but without dwelling on it. The past was referenced gently, often through routine. A recipe remembered, a habit continued, a phrase repeated. These small connections offered reassurance. They suggested that continuity existed, even if circumstances had changed. By the latter part of the year, many felt that 1942 had passed without clear definition. It was not remembered for a single event, but for its atmosphere, for its steadiness, for the way it demanded endurance rather than action. The year did not announce its passing. It simply accumulated days, one after another, until people realized they had lived through it. And as winter approached once more, households prepared again, drawing curtains earlier, layering clothing, planning meals carefully. There was no sense of conclusion. The war had not ended. Circumstances had not resolved. Life continued in its adjusted form. Yet there was quiet pride in having endured, in having maintained routines, in having kept households functioning, in having preserved a sense of normal life, however altered it had become. In this way, daily life in Europe during 1942 did not move toward an ending. It moved forward through repetition, patience, and quiet adaptation. And that, more than any single moment, defined the year. As another day in 1942 came to a close, there was no sense of completion, no marker to suggest progress or resolution. The war, World War II, continued beyond the edges of daily awareness, present but distant, shaping life without announcing itself in every moment. Nights settled quietly. Curtains were drawn once more. Lamps were dimmed. The familiar routine repeated without discussion. These actions required little thought now, having been practiced so many times before. Inside homes, sounds softened. Dishes were set aside, footsteps slowed, voices lowered, even small movements were measured, as though conserving energy for the days ahead. Outside, streets remained dark. What little light existed was carefully controlled. Buildings became shapes, rather than details. Familiar paths were traced from memory alone. Most people were indoors by this hour, not because they were told to be, but because the night offered little reason to linger. Rest was valued. Stillness was accepted. In bedrooms, clothing was folded or placed within reach for morning. Shoes were positioned carefully. Ration cards remained close, where they would not be forgotten. These small preparations were acts of reassurance. They suggested continuity. They implied tomorrow would arrive, and that it would be approached in the same familiar way. Sleep came gradually, not always easily, but steadily enough. Thoughts slowed, attention narrowed, the mind returned to what was known and manageable. Some nights were interrupted, a distant sound, an unfamiliar vibration, a moment of wakefulness that passed without explanation. But most nights remained quiet. And in that quiet, life continued, not in great movements or decisive changes, but in the simple fact of rest, followed by waking, of another day beginning much like the one before it. In 1942, this repetition was not a failure of imagination. It was a form of endurance. People did not wait for the year to end. They lived within it. They allowed days to pass without demanding meaning from each one. Time moved forward quietly, and somewhere beyond the darkness, morning was already approaching, bringing with it the familiar routines of another ordinary day in a year that asked only one thing of those living through it: to continue.